there's a golden rule in geopolitics. Do as the West says, not as the West does. When Europe buys Russian gas, it's a strategic necessity. When India buys Russian oil, it's a moral failure. And when NATO nations quietly maintain trade with Moscow while publicly criticizing others, they call that leadership. Since the Ukraine war began, India has faced mounting pressure to fall in line with Western sanctions. But what's being sold as global unity increasingly looks like selective morality. Because somehow, Russian fossil fuels only fund war when they flow east, not when they power German factories or heat Belgian homes. So the question remains, is this about principles or just preserving Western privilege and comfort in a changing world order? Hello and welcome. You're watching Statecraft with me, Geeta Mohan. Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Western nations have rallied behind a sweeping sanctions regime targeting Russian banks, oil exports, technology flows, and individual oligarchs. The goal, they claimed, was simple: isolate Russia economically, diplomatically, and militarily. But nearly 2.5 years later, something else is becoming clear. While the West calls for isolation, some nations get a pass. Others get pressure. India, it seems, is getting the pressure.
With that sanctions bill saying, listen, if you are the president of China or the prime minister of India or the president of Brazil and you are still trading with the Russians and getting the oil and the gas in and you sometimes even resell it for a higher price, know that if this guy in Moscow doesn't get serious about peace talks, I will slam secondary sanctions on you of 100%. So I'm sure they don't know yet what hit them. This will take some time to sink in, and I think you guys making this clear in the media, the senators maybe also discussing this with their counterparts in Brazil, India, China, will be very helpful to put maximum pressure on Russia in addition to the weapons delivery into Ukraine.
In the past year alone, top US and European officials have warned New Delhi, directly and indirectly, not to deepen its trade ties with Moscow. The implication? That continuing oil imports or defense deals with Russia undermines the West's sanctions strategy. But here's the question no one in NATO is answering. Why is India being singled out when many Western nations continue to trade with Russia themselves? Let's look at the numbers. Since the year 2022, India has emerged as one of the largest importers of Russian crude oil. It now buys over 1 million barrels a day, up from virtually zero before the Ukraine war. The oil is discounted, payments are often in rupees or dirhams, and the shipping lanes are busy. India says it's securing affordable energy for its 1.4 billion citizens. The West says it's funding Putin's war machine. But is that the full picture? Because while India is being publicly criticized for buying Russian oil, NATO countries themselves are still doing business with Russia. Data shows that European Union countries continued to import liquefied natural gas or LNG from Russia at near record levels. In fact, Spain and Belgium became top European buyers of Russian LNG last year.
In terms of our oil purchases, we don't send people out there saying go buy Russian oil. We send people out there saying go buy oil. Now, you buy the best oil you can in the market. So I don't think I would attach a political messaging to that. I would also...
How do you not conflate the two? I mean, I know the Indian-Russian relationship is strong, but you also have issues with China. How do you then sit back and define Indian foreign policy at this point where the West seems to be quite vociferous in trying to curtail funding for the war in Ukraine, whereas by purchasing this oil for national interest, India is being asked, are you funding this war?
So, look, I mean, I don't want to sound argumentative, but then tell me if buying Russian gas is not funding the war? I mean, why is it's only Indian money and oil coming to India which funds, but it's not gas coming to Europe which funds? I mean, look, somewhere, I mean, let's be a little even-handed out here. And even this, look, the whole narrative that it's gone up 9 times. I mean, it's gone up 9 times from a very low base. And it was a very low base because at that time the markets were more open. You know, why if countries in Europe and the West and the United States are so concerned, why don't they allow Iranian oil to come into the market? Why don't they allow Venezuelan oil to come into the market? I mean, they've squeezed every other source of oil we have. And then say, okay, guys, you must not go into the market and guess the best deal for your people. I don't think that's a very fair approach.
So let's get this straight. When India buys discounted Russian oil, it's called complicity. But when European nations buy Russian gas, it's called necessity. When India pays in rupees, it's labeled sanctions evasion. But when Europe channels energy transactions through loopholes, it's labeled pragmatic policy. And the world is watching. Take Germany. After cutting off pipeline gas, Berlin has quietly ramped up Russian LNG imports via ports. Italy too, despite public condemnation of Moscow, imported Russian oil products through third-party channels according to various reports. Even the US, despite leading the sanctions drive, continued to import critical Russian commodities like uranium needed for its nuclear power plants. All of this raises a serious question. Is the West truly committed to isolating Russia economically, or is it more committed to maintaining its own strategic comfort? And if it's the latter, why is India being asked to sacrifice its interests for a sanctions regime that even its architects aren't fully complying with? India's position has been clear from the start. It condemns the war in Ukraine, supports diplomacy and dialogue, but it refuses to be boxed into what it calls a Euro-centric moral binary. New Delhi argues that European conflicts, however grave, should not override the legitimate development and energy needs of the global South. And that includes buying oil wherever it's cheapest.
In February 2022, when the military conflict between Russia and the Ukraine commenced, we were buying, if I remember, 0.2% of our overall crude from the Russian Federation. Today, yes, you are absolutely right, it has gone up considerably. But equally, during this period, India has diversified the sources of supply, and we have gone, I think, from about 27 countries that we used to buy from to about 40 countries now. But more than that, if you go into should you buy from a source one or should you buy from a source two, we have been clear from the day go that we will buy from wherever we have to. Because the Prime Minister's commitment is in the final analysis to his consumer, to the Indian consumer. And I think that policy has stood us in good stead. We are probably one of the few, I would have, if I didn't have this enlightened an audience, I might have said we are the only, but no, we may not be the only. But for a country of our size, for a country of our consumption level, why do I say this? In the last 10, 11 years, 16% of the growth in the energy markets, crude oil, has come from India. And if you believe in the analysis of the International Energy Agency, by the way, I saw a statement that someone might be pulling out of there also, but let's leave it at that. They say, a very credible analysis, that in the next 2 decades, 25% of the global growth is going to come from India. Increase in oil demand.
In fact, Indian officials have repeatedly reminded their Western counterparts that Europe bought far more Russian energy in the first year of the war than India ever did. In 2022 alone, the EU paid Russia over $120 billion for fossil fuels. India, just over $50 billion. Yet it's India that keeps getting the lectures. And it's not just about oil. India also maintains a long-standing defense relationship with Russia, dating back to the Cold War. Roughly 60 to 70% of India's military equipment is of Russian origin. Spare parts, upgrades, ammunition, and technology transfers remain critical. New Delhi says breaking ties suddenly would be suicidal. NATO says it's unacceptable. But here too, double standards abound. Turkey, a NATO member, bought Russia's S-400 missile system in 2019, prompting US sanctions under the CATSA law. But Ankara remains very much inside NATO. And more importantly, Washington now looks the other way as Turkey plays both sides, supplying drones to Ukraine but also trading grain and gas with Russia. So when India continues defense purchases from Russia, it's called strategic disobedience. But when Turkey, Hungary, or even Germany do the same, it's called balancing interests. One set of rules for allies, another for partners outside the Western club. Contradictions don't stop there. In March 2024, US lawmakers revived the threat of secondary sanctions, targeting countries that facilitate Russian trade. Though India wasn't named, the message was loud and clear. Reports suggested Washington was monitoring Indian refineries exporting Russian processed fuel to Europe. Imagine that. The West buys refined Russian oil from India, then warns India for buying Russian oil in the first place. Caught in this geopolitical theater is a deeper debate about multipolarity, sovereignty, and the future of global trade. India argues that the world can no longer be divided into Western-led coalitions and the rest, that economic self-interest is not the sole preserve of NATO capitals, and that sovereign nations should not be punished for pursuing pragmatic diplomacy. And the Global South appears to agree. Across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, India's position is seen not as betrayal but as realism. These countries too rely on Russian energy, wheat, fertilizer, and defense equipment. They too have resisted Western pressure to choose a side, and they see India not as a sanctions dodger but as a standard bearer for non-alignment 2.0. At the recent BRICS summit, Brazil called for it and others chimed in when they called for a new global financial architecture, one less dependent on the US dollar and less vulnerable to weaponized sanctions. The move was not just symbolic. It reflected a growing frustration in the Global South about how the rules of global trade seem to change depending on who's writing them. However, in the words of Brazilian President Lula da Silva, Emperor Trump wasn't too pleased about it.
Não queremos imperador. Nós somos países soberanos. Ora, se ele achar que ele pode taxar, os países têm o direito de taxar também. Existe a lei da reciprocidade. Eu acho muito equivocado e muito irresponsável um presidente ficar ameaçando os outros em redes digitais. Sinceramente, tem outras coisas e outros fóruns para um presidente de um país do tamanho dos Estados Unidos.
BRICS was set up to hurt us. BRICS was set up to degenerate our dollar and take our dollar as the standard, take it off as the standard. And that's okay if they want to play that game, but I can play that game too. So anybody that's in BRICS is getting a 10% charge.
Is that immediate, sir, or is
Yeah,
that
pretty
if
soon.
they engage in some behavior?
Well, if they're a member of BRICS, they're going to have to pay 10% tariff.
Consider this. Over 500 Western companies have exited Russia since 2022, but hundreds of others, many based in Europe, still operate there. From food and pharma to chemicals and machinery, trade continues under exemptions, waivers, and quiet deals. But when Indian firms seek similar flexibility, they face warnings. This isn't just about fairness, it's about credibility. If NATO wants the world to rally behind sanctions as a moral tool, it must apply them universally. Selective outrage only weakens the cause. And worse, it alienates rising powers like India, whose cooperation is essential for any truly global pressure campaign. The hypocrisy also erodes trust. In private, many Indian officials believe the West's real discomfort isn't with oil or defense, but with India's growing assertiveness. That beneath the lectures lies a deeper unease, that India, once a junior partner, now insists on charting its own path, one that doesn't always align with Washington, D.C., London, or Brussels.
The developments, let me reiterate, and I've said this in the past as well, securing energy needs of our people is understandably an overriding priority for us. In this endeavor, we are guided by what is there on offer in the markets, as also by the prevailing global circumstances. We would particularly caution against any double standards on the matter.
And India is not alone. Saudi Arabia recently signed new energy and infrastructure deals with Russia. Brazil has resisted arms shipment to Ukraine. Indonesia has boosted fertilizer imports from Moscow. Even African nations have hosted Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov multiple times since the war began. This isn't drift, it's divergence. The global order is evolving from Western dominance to multipolar competition, and in that transition, politics of sanctions is being tested. Are they tools of global justice or instruments of geopolitical pressure? Are they principles or power plays? India's experience suggests the latter. New Delhi's message is increasingly blunt. It will not accept Western pressure to abandon energy security. It will not be lectured by countries that themselves continue backdoor deals. And it will not apologize for diplomacy that prioritizes its people over Western geopolitics.
I say this to their credit. They were also quite understanding about it because, one issue which has been, in a sense, distorted, the whole energy trade. The fact is that after 2022, you did not want the Ukraine conflict to trigger a global energy crisis. We did not want to see global inflation, and which meant that somebody had to buy Russian oil if the oil markets had to be kept at a reasonable price. So I think there was an understanding about the need for that, and in fact, I remind people, that was one of the reasons why there was a very conscious decision not to, mix that trade with sanctions.
This has led India to diversify its strategic bets. From expanding ties with the Gulf and ASEAN to deepening trade with Africa and Latin America, India is rebalancing. The US and Europe remain important partners, but not exclusive ones. Let me just put it this way. We'll walk with the West, but not always behind it. That independence is now being tested. If Washington or Brussels escalate sanctions rhetoric, they risk pushing India closer to alternative systems, like the China-led financial arrangements or BRICS currency framework. That would be a strategic self-goal for the West. And make no mistake, India isn't seeking conflict. It wants peace in Ukraine. It has sent humanitarian aid. It has spoken to both Zelensky and Putin, but it will not let distant wars dictate domestic policy, especially when the very countries asking for Indian restraint refuse to show it themselves. So here's the bottom line. Sanctions are only as strong as their consistency, and moral authority only works if it's universal. By singling out India while ignoring its own contradictions, NATO risks losing not just influence, but integrity. In the end, this is about more than oil. It's about trust, about whether a new global order will be built on shared principles or shifting privileges. India's trade with Russia may challenge the West's strategy, but the West's double standards challenge something deeper, its claim to global leadership. Because leadership in today's world can no longer be demanded, it must be earned, and it starts with fairness. Thank you for watching Statecraft.